Autumn 1944. On the western edge of Europe, the Allies had broken through Normandy, but not Germany. The Siegfried Line rose ahead. Miles of concrete bunkers, steel doors, and gun emplacements, buried beneath layers of earth and reinforced wire. Behind those walls waited men, who believed nothing short of a miracle could dislodge them. Then, one morning, German forward observers heard a sound they did not recognize. It was not the whistle of aircraft or the stutter of field guns. It was a deep, rolling concussion, like distant thunder, repeating itself in slow, deliberate rhythm. Moments later, entire bunker sections disappeared under fountains of dirt and shattered steel. The shells that landed weighed nearly 350 pounds each, thrown from guns so large that their barrels were taller than a man. The Americans had brought a new weapon to the front, the 240mm Howitzer M1, the heaviest field artillery piece ever used by the United States Army in combat. The soldiers who served it simply called it the Black Dragon. To the Germans who faced it, it was a nightmare that came from beyond the horizon. The story of the 240mm Howitzer began long before it fired its first shell. In the 1920s, the United States had few reasons to build siege artillery. World War I had ended with lessons favoring mobility, not weight. Artillery officers talked of tractors, trucks, and fast movement rather than concrete-breaking shells. But among the quiet halls of the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department, a few engineers remembered the stalemate of 1917, when German 210mm guns outranged every American piece in France. They knew another war would require a weapon capable of smashing fortifications, not merely suppressing them. Development was slow. The Great Depression starved budgets. Design drawings collected dust in Rock Island Arsenal's archives. By 1939, only prototypes existed, and even those were outdated. Then, Europe ignited again. Reports from Poland and France told of concrete bunkers resisting everything short of direct aerial hits. When German 240mm and 280mm mortars leveled Polish fortresses, American observers took note. The United States needed its own fortress. 310. The challenge was scale. A 240mm projectile weighed as much as 2 adult men and required a separate propellant charge the size of a suitcase. The complete weapon would weigh over 64,000 pounds in firing position. No existing carriage could hold it. Engineers at Watervliet Arsenal began sketching a new split trail mount, a twin-beam base that could absorb the recoil without collapsing. Each half would ride on 8-wheel bogies pulled by powerful M6 tractors. Disassembly was mandatory for movement. Barrel, cradle, and carriage separated into 3 loads. Setting up the gun took trained crews up to 2 hours, even under ideal conditions. Yet, once emplaced, its effect was unlike anything the U.S. Army had ever fielded. The M1 could lob a 360-pound high-explosive shell 25,225 yards, nearly 14.3 miles, with remarkable accuracy. A single round could collapse reinforced concrete several feet thick. It could destroy what medium artillery only scarred. Because of its size, everything about the 240mm Howitzer became a study in precision logistics. Even the tools to assemble it weighed more than some field guns. Each gun had its own crane truck, power generator, and maintenance trailer. When moving into position, convoys stretched half a mile. Soldiers joked that the weapon fought 2 battles, one against Germany and another against gravity. In 1942, the first experimental units formed at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The men assigned quickly realized they were part of something unusual. Most had trained on 105mm or 155mm howitzers. The M1 was a different world. It required mathematics, patience, and teamwork bordering on choreography. A full firing detachment numbered 14 to 17 men. Gun commander, 2 gunners, 6 loaders, and several handling the cranes, shells, and powder bags. Every movement was timed. A single misstep could cost fingers or lives. When the breach opened, the barrel yawned like a tunnel. Loaders used a rammer with hydraulic assist to seat the projectile, then shoved powder bags behind it, each marked with charge increments for range control. The breach closed with a metallic crash heard even through earplugs. At firing, the entire weapon recoiled nearly 5 feet, then rolled back onto its spades with a heavy sigh of compressed air. The blast wave threw dust in circles. Observers miles away mistook the concussion for bombs dropped from aircraft. By late 1943, production accelerated. The first units, equipped with 8 guns each, shipped to Italy. There, they met their first test at Anzio and Monte Cassino, 2 names that would define Allied siege warfare. At Anzio, the Germans held ridges overlooking the beachhead. Their artillery, dug into caves and reinforced houses, rained shells daily on the thin Allied line. Conventional 155mm howitzers barely scratched those defenses. Then, in March 1944, the first 240mm guns rolled into position behind the beaches. It took half a day to assemble them under camouflage nets. When they finally opened fire, the effect was immediate. Observers described enemy bunkers folding like cardboard. A German officer later wrote in a captured diary that the new American mortars, howitzers, break through even our thickest concrete. We can do nothing but pray they do not fire again before night. The Black Dragon had earned its name. Moving these weapons was nearly as difficult as firing them. Each gun required 2 heavy tractors and multiple trailers. Bridges had to be reinforced or bypassed. Soft ground demanded steel mats. At every new site, engineers built platforms of crushed rock to prevent the spades from sinking. Crews learned to treat the process like ritual. Pick ground, level, align, anchor, assemble, test, and only then fire. A single firing mission might take an entire day of preparation, but once the first shell left the barrel, no one doubted the result. Concrete casemates along the Gustav Line that had resisted weeks of air raids cracked open within hours. The Germans counterfired desperately, but their shells fell short. The 240mm range exceeded almost everything they had in theater. Captured intelligence reports from 1944 show the Wehrmacht attempting to classify this new weapon. Early observers believed it to be a 210mm or 8.8-inch gun. Only after finding unexploded fragments did they realize it was far larger. German engineers estimated the shell weight at no less than 150 kilograms. They warned that bunkers once considered safe are now vulnerable. Psychologically, the effect went beyond destruction. Unlike air raids, which came with warning sirens, these shells arrived silently. By the time troops heard the distant thunder of the discharge, the projectile was seconds from impact. The first explosion often killed communications. The second buried survivors. Those who endured spoke of invisible guns that destroy the world around you without being seen. To Allied commanders, the 240mm howitzer proved that brute force still had a place in modern war. General Mark Clark praised its performance at Cassino, noting that nothing short of this weapon or a direct aerial hit could remove the German guns from the monastery heights. General Omar Bradley later ordered several battalions transferred to France in preparation for breaching the Siegfried Line. By the autumn of 1944, as American forces approached Aachen, convoys of these guns rumbled east through muddy French roads. Locals watched in awe, each barrel massive, covered in grease and dust, rolling behind tractors under canvas. To the soldiers hauling them, they were slow, stubborn beasts. To the Germans awaiting them, they were thunder-made metal. The first wide-scale employment of the 240mm howitzer in Northwest Europe came as the Allies prepared to crack the Siegfried Line in late 1944 and early 1945. The line itself was a belt of concrete and steel, a series of pillboxes, bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles designed to slow any invasion from the west. It was exactly the kind of target for which the American Army had built its heaviest field piece. In October 1944, artillery battalions moved into positions within range of the line. They chose ground that offered cover from air observation, and enough back area to hide the long convoys. Engineers poured compacted stone platforms, then set the carriages, aligned the sights, and tested the elevating mechanisms. The first salvos were aimed at concrete casemates labeled as regimental strongpoints, structures with walls measured in feet rather than inches. The 240mm round did not merely dent the surface. It assaulted the mass, penetrating the outer layers of reinforced concrete, disrupting interior supports, and causing chamber collapses that returned dust and masonry into the air like a storm. A single well-placed projectile could reduce a firing room to rubble, making the casemate unusable and leaving behind twisted steel and jagged rebar. German defenders responded at once, but the options available to them were limited. Counter-battery fire attempted to locate and silence the American gun positions. Yet locating the 240mm was difficult. The weight and the setup required the Americans to emplace in areas with substantial engineering support. They employed camouflage, decoys, and movement at night to frustrate observers. When counter-battery radar tried to triangulate, the slow, irregular pattern of shots helped the guns remain hidden long enough to complete a mission and move if necessary. The Wehrmacht also tried concrete reinforcement. They dug deeper protective pits, added thicker ceilings, and staggered firing rooms. But the 240mm shell was designed to transfer enormous explosive energy at points of impact. It created cavities inside the bunker that no amount of shallow reinforcement could fully absorb. Field accounts from German engineers show the psychological effect as strongly as the physical damage. One report described crews operating inside a bunker where the next shell struck the roof. They felt the floor lift beneath their boots, then collapse in parts. Men survived by moving into side corridors where the blast pressure was reduced, only to be trapped by the rubble later. British and American infantry who followed the artillery reported that positions previously thought untakeable surrendered after a day of concentrated heavy fire. The 240mm, used in combination with airstrikes and medium artillery, made a layered attack that overwhelmed static defenses. Where earlier doctrine had favored prolonged siege and infantry probes, commanders now used the heavy gun to create a gap and then pour mobile units through. Crews who manned the Black Dragon learned to respect her temper. Sergeant Thomas Reeves, a veteran of the 1st Battalion of the 56th Field Artillery, recounted a typical mission in a short letter after the war. They would arrive at dawn, unload the barrel, assemble the cradle, then slide the projectile into the bore. Reeves wrote in careful sentences that men learned to move like a single organism. He described the sound as a living thing, a low voice that filled the valley and left birds stunned in the trees. At night, crews slept near the cranes that served as bedside lamps. They knew the Germans would try to find them by sound. They practiced silent assembly and maintained radio silence until the firing mission began. When the first round left the barrel, everyone felt a mixture of fear and triumph. No one relished being a target, but each man also knew that their work could save infantry lives by removing a machine that killed from a distance. Not every mission went smoothly. A maintenance log from one battery shows the kind of mechanical troubles that could delay action for days. A cracked recoil recuperator, a twisted sighting mount, or a failed crane bearing could keep a gun silent. Repair parts were heavy and scarce on the move. When supply trucks could not reach forward areas, crews improvised with welder shops and borrowed pieces from wrecked vehicles. The resourcefulness of those men kept the guns in action, but it also revealed the fragility of a system that relied on enormous components. German countermeasures included tactical withdrawal, camouflage, and concentration on the gun tractor columns. Field units attempted to strike the M6 tractors before the guns could be assembled. Ambushes on road convoys were common, especially where bridges created predictable choke points. Where the terrain allowed, German defenders also used demolition of roads to slow movement. The Wehrmacht deployed electronic countermeasures when possible. They increased overflights to drop light illumination and then observed for the large silhouettes of the gun and its assembly crews. At times, they used local air units to attempt to engage while the guns were exposed. But by late 1944, Allied air superiority made low-altitude interdiction increasingly difficult. Another German tactic was misdirection. Reports show they attempted to feint attacks and set up dummy positions to draw American artillery resources away. Dummy guns, constructed from timber and canvas, appeared on ridgelines only to collapse under observation without delivering the desired effect. The scale of the 240mm remained unique. A fake wooden barrel could not mimic the thunder, nor could a mock carriage fool sound ranging equipment for long. In some sectors, German engineers counterattacked. They used specialized demolition teams to attack the cranes and ammunition trains. Small units infiltrated forward areas at night, with satchel charges intended to disable the cranes that lifted projectiles. When successful, these raids could render a battery temporarily impotent. But such operations were risky and costly, and they did not always succeed. Understanding the 240mm requires detail. There were two primary variants in the era, one originally designed in World War I and the newer M1. The American M1 used separate loading ammunition, meaning the projectile and the propellant charges were handled separately. This allowed crews to tailor the firing charge to the desired range. Charges were measured in increments and stacked in cloth bags that produced different muzzle velocities. The standard high-explosive shell weighed approximately 360 pounds, though armor-piercing and concrete-piercing shells of different designs were available. The explosive filling was substantial, and fragments from a detonation traveled with lethal energy for hundreds of meters. To compare, the more common 155mm shell weighed about 95 pounds. One 240mm round equaled the destructive effect of several 155 shells combined. Rate of fire, however, was slow. A well-trained crew could manage one round every 2 minutes under sustained conditions. That pace meant that a battery of 4 guns might deliver only 120 rounds in a day, if conditions allowed. By contrast, lighter artillery could pound out far more shells, but none with the same single-round effect against concrete. Accuracy at long ranges depended on careful surveying. Survey teams established reference points with theodolites and fixed markers. Meteorological readings were taken to account for wind, temperature, and air density. Even small errors in azimuth produced hundreds of yards of miss at maximum range. Despite these challenges, the weapon proved precise enough to strike roof lines and to hit attitude-sensitive targets, such as embrasures and gun ports. There were also specialized ammunition types. Concrete-piercing shells used a hardened cap and a delay fuse, intending to penetrate before detonation. The effect was to create deep internal strikes that split structural supports. In some cases, crews used a combination approach, striking a fortification with high explosive and then following up with concrete piercing to finish what the first round had opened. Commanders learned to use the 240mm not as a solitary weapon, but as a tool in a repertoire. They coordinated barrages with aerial reconnaissance and close infantry probes. The psychological effect came not only from physical destruction, but also from the knowledge that concrete was no longer safe. Infantry could advance under the relative cover of rubble where machine guns had been reduced to rusting ruins. This changed the tempo of assaults and reduced the need for costly frontal attacks. At times, the guns served in counter-battery roles against enemy heavy artillery. When the Germans deployed their own large calibers, targeting such emplacements became a priority. A direct hit could invert a crater into a new hazard for the defenders. Because of the limited supply of 240mm ammunition, commanders selected priority targets with care. The shells were not expended on trivial objectives. A famous example occurred near the Hurling forest, where dense terrain had favored defensive positions. Allied planners employed the 240mm to neutralize a series of pillboxes and roadblocks that impeded armored movement. After the heavy rounds breached these positions, armored units could pass and exploit a corridor. The scale of the weapon allowed planners to. The same traits that made the 240mm devastating also created vulnerabilities. Its size limited mobility. It could not keep pace with rapid advances. When armies moved quickly, the heavy guns lagged, requiring roads able to bear their weight, and supply lines to deliver ammunition. In the fast thrusts across northern France, in the summer of 1944, Commanders often left the heaviest artillery behind in favor of more mobile forces. Ammunition supply was another constraint. Each shell was heavy, requiring specialized handling equipment and secure transport. A single battalion could consume several hundred rounds in a week if employed intensively, straining logistical networks. Railheads became essential supply points, and damage to rail lines could temporarily starve batteries of their shells. Maintenance proved complex. The immense stresses of firing demanded routine checks of recoil mechanisms, bearings, and the barrel surface. Barrels showed wear after hundreds of rounds, degrading accuracy. Reboring or replacement of barrels was not a forward operation. It required depot-level support and time away from the front. Finally, the gun was vulnerable to air attack when in assembly. During movements, especially in the open, long-range observation aircraft could pass information to artillery spotters. As Allied air superiority increased, the windows for assembly became narrower. Crews learned to emplace at night and to break down quickly after firing to minimize risk. Captured German reports and post-war interviews provide a human perspective on the gun's impact. A battalion commander recorded that his men had lost faith in the protective value of concrete casemates after a concentrated mission. He wrote that morale dropped, and men who once trusted their bunkers now slept in foxholes. Another report detailed how supply officers scrambled to reroute fuel and ammunition trains to provide extra shells to threatened sectors. Court records and interrogation transcripts sometimes recorded disbelief among frontline soldiers. A young private asked how a nation as distant as America could deliver such ruin with apparent ease. His sergeant answered simply that it came from the industrial machine across the sea. By the spring of 1945, doctrine adapted. Heavy guns were assigned to specific siege duties, held in reserve for the most demanding tasks. Engineers studied the effects of the rounds and redesigned subsequent fortifications with deeper reinforced layers and more dispersion of vital compartments. But the essential lesson remained clear. Quantity of explosives, complemented by concentrated application, supported by logistics and intelligence, could defeat even the deepest concrete. By early 1944 in Italy, Allied progress had slowed to a crawl. German defenses, perched along mountain ridges, turned every mile into a siege. One fortress in particular, the ancient abbey of Monte Cassino, had resisted months of assault and aerial bombardment. From its height, German spotters directed artillery that pinned entire divisions in the valleys below. Repeated bombing runs left the abbey scarred, but not silenced. The thick masonry still sheltered defenders. Then the heavy guns arrived. The 240mm howitzers of the 697th and 698th Field Artillery Battalions were dragged into position through rain and mud. They were so large that bridges trembled as tractors crossed. Engineers reinforced the ground beneath each spade with layers of rock and steel plates. Observers described the first fire mission as a visible tremor through the valley. At each shot, windows rattled in nearby villages. The sound rolled for miles, echoing from ridge to ridge. Within days, the abbey walls began to fracture. Stones that had stood for centuries disintegrated under the concentrated bombardment. German troops entrenched near the monastery called it the hammer from the sea, believing the shells went from naval guns off the coast. They could not imagine such power being delivered from the plains below. Yet the range and elevation tables confirmed the shots were purely land-based, fired from miles away by men who never saw their targets directly. In February 1944, at Anzio, the situation reversed. This time it was the Germans holding high ground, the Allies trapped on the beachhead. German 170mm and 210mm guns pounded the beach relentlessly. The 240mm howitzers became the only weapons capable of striking back with equal or greater force. Firing tables show that at maximum charge, their shells could reach German batteries hidden 12 miles inland. Spotters directed fire using aerial reconnaissance and sound triangulation. The large American shells not only silenced enemy guns, but also shattered morale. German prisoners later admitted they had never experienced concussions so violent that helmets rang like bells. During one night mission, a single battery fired 24 rounds against a cave complex used as an ammunition depot. The first hits sealed the entrances. The final ones ignited the stockpiles within. Witnesses miles away saw the explosion rise into the sky like a small volcano. The crater measured 60 feet wide and 20 feet deep. By mid-1944, German intelligence divisions had compiled detailed reports on the American 240mm schwere Howitzer. They noted its rarity, its destructive effect, and the impossibility of duplication under wartime conditions. German industrial production was strained to the limit. Resources were directed toward tanks, aircraft, and rockets. A new artillery line of such massive weapons was beyond reach. Propaganda units were instructed not to emphasize the weapon publicly. Acknowledging its existence would only demoralize the front. Instead, soldiers were told that American superguns were inaccurate and wasteful. But internal memos told the truth. One analysis concluded that enemy heavy artillery of 240mm caliber or greater is capable of defeating reinforced concrete positions of any known design. By the time the Allies crossed into Germany itself, the weapon's reputation had grown almost mythic. German soldiers often surrendered positions after a few ranging shots, unwilling to endure bombardments that tore open bunkers once believed indestructible. At Watervliet Arsenal in New York, where most barrels were made, engineers worked around the clock. Each barrel was a masterpiece of steel, 25 feet long, and machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The inner surface had to withstand pressures exceeding 40,000 pounds per square inch. Every groove was inspected with magnetic instruments for flaws invisible to the eye. Manufacturing records show that a single barrel required over 30 tons of high-grade alloy steel and nearly 10,000 labor hours to complete. Workers there referred to them as metal organs, each one designed to play a deep note of thunder somewhere across the ocean. While the weapon's results were celebrated, its use demanded endurance from those who served it. The concussion alone caused headaches and nosebleeds among crews who worked too close without proper ear protection. The crane operators risked crushed limbs handling shells in darkness. Loading errors could be fatal. A single powder bag inserted backward could ignite prematurely. At least 15 men were recorded killed or seriously injured by accidents involving the 240mm between 1943 and 1945. In field conditions, even a routine firing sequence carried tension. Crews learned to respect the silence between shots as much as the roar that followed. The 240mm howitzer stood at the crossroads between old siege artillery and the coming age of mechanized firepower. It represented the last generation of guns that required complete disassembly for movement. After 1945, rocket artillery and self-propelled howitzers would replace its kind. But during the final year of the Second World War, it served as the physical embodiment of Allied industrial might. Where the Germans relied on speed, precision, and field fortifications, the Americans used abundance, coordination, and overwhelming logistics. Each 240mm gun symbolized that approach. Its presence on the battlefield said as much about factories and transport ships as it did about soldiers. After the war, Allied intelligence conducted interviews with German officers who had faced the weapon. Colonel Ernst Weber of the 88th Infantry Division recalled an encounter near Aachen. He described feeling the shock of distant detonations that collapsed an observation post, even though the shells landed several hundred meters away. He wrote that, "Our men did not fear the shell as a projectile. They feared it as an event." Another officer, captured during the Ruhr campaign, compared the howitzer's fire to the ground itself exploding. He said that after 2 days of bombardment, the term bunker no longer carried meaning. Every refuge could be broken open. His final comment, recorded verbatim, reads, "We had prepared for a long war of endurance." The Americans brought a short war of annihilation. By April 1945, 240mm battalions had participated in the destruction of more than 60 major fortified positions across Europe. They reduced casemates along the Saar, breached the Siegfried Line near Zweibrücken, and supported the crossing of the Rhine. When the guns spoke, walls disappeared. At Remagen, where Allied troops captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact, engineers feared German artillery would bring it down. The heavy howitzers answered with counter-battery fire so intense that the opposing guns ceased firing after an hour. By neutralizing those positions, the 240mm indirectly ensured one of the most critical crossings of the war remained open. When the fighting ended, crews faced an unexpected melancholy. The machines they had served so long stood quiet, their barrels pitted and stained from heat. Some guns were scrapped on site, others shipped back to depots for storage. Many soldiers described an emptiness that followed the last firing mission, a sense that something immense and mechanical had also gone to rest. For a brief moment in history, these men had commanded the loudest voice on earth. They had seen entire mountainsides shudder to that voice, and watched the enemy surrender to its echo. After the war, several 240mm howitzers were preserved in military museums. Their sheer presence dwarfs modern artillery. Visitors often stand silent before them, trying to imagine the logistics, the teamwork, and the deafening blast. Few realize that the men who operated them considered them both magnificent and terrifying. In later interviews, veterans spoke not of glory, but of responsibility. One said simply, "You do not feel proud of a gun like that. You feel small next to it." To them, the Black Dragon had been less a weapon than a force of nature they happened to guide. The sound that carried across nations among Allied soldiers, the sound of the 240mm howitzer became a kind of legend. Infantry units advancing behind the bombardments described it as a comfort. They said it meant progress. One officer recalled that whenever the deep report rolled through the clouds, men stopped talking and smiled. They knew something large and dangerous was being erased ahead. To civilians in occupied villages, the sound meant liberation. French farmers who had watched German convoys retreat through their fields remembered the air shaking, the windows bending inward, the sky flickering pale white as the shells detonated beyond the hills. Children later told historians that they believed the Americans had brought thunder itself. Every firing created a signature in the earth. The recoil plates dug trenches into the ground that filled with rainwater and smoke. Trees nearby lost their leaves in a single breath of concussion. Cows fell silent for hours after. The environment itself seemed to pause between shots. The scale of logistics behind the gun was staggering. Each projectile traveled a long path before it reached the barrel. Factories in Illinois, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey cast the shells. They were machined, filled, crated, and sent by rail to East Coast ports. From there, ships carried them to depots in Britain, then trains hauled them toward the front. The journey of one shell from factory floor to target could exceed 5,000 miles. Every shell bore stenciled codes: lot number, explosive type, and inspection mark. Crews treated them almost as living objects. Before firing, each projectile was cleaned, the rotating band inspected for burrs, and the fuse carefully selected. Time fuses were adjusted using hand tools with micrometer precision. It took patience and calm, even under fire. When firing at maximum charge, crews stepped back several paces. The concussion pressed the uniform against their skin. Dust fell from helmets. A few seconds later came the faint sound of impact far away, followed by a low rumble through the ground. The men looked at each other, nodded once, and began loading the next shell. The heavy artillery camps functioned like small towns. Tents, cook stations, repair shops, even barber corners appeared beside the weapons. At night, generators hummed, and the smell of oil mixed with the scent of coffee and cordite. Between missions, men cleaned equipment until every bolt shone, then wrote letters home beside the silent barrels. Mail from these units often described the landscape of thunder. Soldiers drew sketches of mountains lit by flashes, of shells passing overhead like invisible meteors. They rarely mentioned fear. Instead, they wrote of exhaustion, of the endless task of keeping the machine alive. The bond among crews was absolute because every man's safety depended on the precision of the others. Mechanics spoke of the barrel like a living creature that demanded attention. It had moods. A cold morning could shift its alignment. A worn thread could affect its aim. Before each mission, they checked pressure gauges, replaced recoil seals, and greased every fitting. When the order to fire came, all conversation stopped. Only the voice of the section chief broke the silence, counting down until the final word: fire. The presence of the 240mm gun altered strategic planning. Generals could now target structures previously immune to artillery. Railway tunnels, coastal batteries, and bridgeheads could be eliminated without naval bombardment. At St. Malo and Brest, the heavy guns supported attacks on German submarine pens. Though the reinforced concrete there measured up to 12 feet thick, repeated strikes eventually cracked the roofs open. Reports from naval observers confirmed that what air raids failed to destroy, the heavy howitzers could dismantle piece by piece. For every target reduced, engineers recorded data, the number of rounds, impact angles, and fuse effects. That information became part of post-war doctrine, influencing how future armies designed both fortifications and siege weapons. When the German counteroffensive began in December 1944, known later as the Battle of the Bulge, several 240mm units were caught in the sudden chaos. Heavy snow and fog grounded aircraft, leaving the howitzers as one of the few long-range weapons able to answer. Moving them in freezing conditions was a nightmare. Engines froze, hydraulic lines burst, and tractors skidded on ice. Yet the guns kept firing. Crews improvised by burning fuel under the recoil cylinders to keep the fluid from thickening. They wrapped blankets around the breech blocks and used tarps as makeshift windbreaks. The barrels steamed in the cold, releasing white vapor after each shot like breath from a giant. Artillery observers credited those batteries with stopping several German assembly areas from ever launching attacks. One officer noted that the 240mm could not move fast, but it could anchor a front. Its presence stabilized lines, discouraged assaults, and gave commanders confidence to hold when other units were withdrawing. By early 1945, German troops learned to recognize the distant thunder. They developed superstitions about it. Some claimed that listening to the blast 3 times in succession brought luck, while others said it foretold death. Psychologists later studying captured diaries found recurring descriptions of the deep one, or the invisible gun. No one wrote of hearing it directly overhead. They only wrote of hearing it before something disappeared. Commanders tried to mitigate its effects through dispersion and deception. Rather than fortify single strongpoints, they began scattering forces into smaller trenches and foxholes. But dispersion reduced defensive firepower. The 240mm thus indirectly weakened German cohesion, forcing them to abandon the fortress concept that had once defined their strategy. Each impact of the 240mm was an engineering experiment in itself. Observers measured the craters and noted how the blast vented sideways through fissures in the soil. A detonation against reinforced walls created a distinct pattern of fracture known as radial spalling. At close range, the explosion stripped surfaces clean of paint and left behind gray rock that glittered like metal under sunlight. The howitzer's designers had predicted this. The round's fuse delay allowed it to burrow a few feet before exploding, ensuring maximum internal pressure. In bunkers tested after the war, the cavities created by such hits resembled caves carved by explosives, wide enough for a man to stand inside. Engineers photographed these results and circulated them through military journals. They proved that industrial precision combined with scientific understanding could outmatch even the thickest walls built by hand. When the war concluded, not all the 240mm guns were scrapped. A few were kept in reserve, stored in depots in the United States and Japan. Some served briefly in the early Cold War, during testing of atomic-era fortifications. By the 1950s, newer self-propelled systems like the M65 Atomic Annie had taken over their role. But veterans who had once worked the old howitzers said none of the later weapons inspired the same awe. They called the 240mm the last true siege gun, the final voice of the industrial age before rockets made the Earth itself part of the arsenal. It had no computer guidance, no hydraulics beyond what men could repair with wrenches, no digital systems to aim. It was muscle, math, and teamwork forged into iron. Looking back, historians often describe the weapon as unnecessary, arguing that air power alone could have achieved similar results. But the records show otherwise. Air bombardment was often scattered by weather, while the howitzers delivered precise, repeatable blows regardless of clouds or nightfall. They gave commanders certainty, and certainty is the rarest asset in war. The German army learned that concrete could no longer protect ideology. The Allies learned that logistics could be as decisive as courage. And the men who pulled the lanyards learned humility in the face of the power they unleashed. A photograph from the end of the war shows a crew posing beside their gun after the final mission. They are smiling, but their eyes look distant. Behind them lies a landscape flattened into silence. The caption reads only, "Mission complete." The guns fell silent, but the world they shaped did not. After the surrender in May 1945, engineers, officers, and scientists from every nation rushed to collect data. The Allies wanted to know how the tools of total war had performed, which ideas would survive, and which belonged to history. Among the weapons studied most closely was the 240mm howitzer M1. In hangars and depots across Europe, teams measured the damage left by its shells. They examined fractured bunkers, twisted rebar, and concrete peeled like bark from trees. For the first time, war was treated as a laboratory, and the 240mm became one of its most revealing experiments. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, surviving guns were reassembled for scientific trials. Cameras recorded the shockwave as shells struck reinforced blocks. High-speed film captured dust expanding outward in perfect circles. The test confirmed what soldiers had known in their bones. Raw mechanical force, when guided by mathematics, could defeat almost any structure made by men. Yet the trials also revealed limitations. Each barrel required replacement after roughly 700 rounds. Maintenance consumed enormous resources, and the transport system depended on vehicles soon to be obsolete. In the era of jets and atomic bombs, a weapon that took 2 hours to assemble seemed a relic. Still, the lessons remained. Engineers used the data to design new recoil systems, breech locks, and propellant charges. Those innovations flowed into the next generation of self-propelled guns. In that sense, the 240mm lived on not as a machine, but as an idea. When the Iron Curtain divided Europe, American planners again thought about siege artillery. The Soviet Union fielded massive guns of its own, the 203mm B4 and later the 240mm M240 mortar. Both owed a quiet debt to the American experiments of the previous decade. Design drawings captured in Germany had circulated among Soviet engineers, and the concept of the heavy, slow, unstoppable fortress breaker found new life. In the early 1950s, the United States produced the M65, known informally as Atomic Annie. It could fire a small nuclear shell across 20 miles. Observers at the time noted its lineage. The M65's cradle and transport design mirrored that of the old M1. The Black Dragon had given birth to a creature of fire even greater than itself. Artillery doctrine changed because of what the 240mm had proved. Before the war, armies believed only navies could deliver decisive blows against fortifications. After 1945, land forces knew that with enough industry, they could generate the same power from soil instead of sea. Every modern howitzer that followed, from the M110 to the PZH-2000, carries something of its geometry, its patience, and its scale. Even the modern concept of modular transport originated here. Breaking a weapon into barrel, carriage, and cradle became standard practice for heavy ordnance. It allowed nations to build larger systems than their roads or bridges could otherwise carry. The idea that men could move mountains piece by piece was not metaphor. It was the daily routine of those artillerymen. After the war, many veterans returned to civilian life, but never fully left the sound of that gun behind. Some became engineers, others teachers or machinists. A few joined the Army Reserve and continued training new crews until the early 1950s. They carried lessons of precision and discipline into peacetime industries that would later build bridges, highways, and power plants. The same hands that once loaded shells built the post-war world's infrastructure. Letters preserved in the Library of Congress show that some crews even named their tractors, cranes, and tools. One gun was called Faithful Mary, another Texas Thunder. These nicknames appeared again in reunion photographs decades later, painted on banners as if the weapons were still alive. Across the ocean, former German officers also reflected on the weapon. In 1956, a study for the Bundeswehr's newly forming artillery branch analyzed Allied siege tactics. It concluded that the moral impact of the 240mm was out of all proportion to its numerical presence. Only a few dozen guns had ever reached the front, yet every German corps believed hundreds existed. Veterans remembered the thunder and the dust columns. They spoke of bunkers cracking open without warning, of telephones going dead, of concrete turning into powder. One recalled that after facing the weapon near Metz, he stopped believing in any permanent defense. That shift in mindset, historians argue, helped post-war Germany abandon the culture of fortresses and embrace mobility and alliance. The 240mm's greatest victory was invisible. It changed how soldiers imagined safety. For thousands of years, men had trusted walls. The Black Dragon taught them that no wall was absolute. In the 20th century, that realization prepared minds for the atomic age, where destruction came not by weight alone, but by principle. Artillerymen of later generations studied the weapon with a kind of reverence. They spoke of it as discipline made steel. Every motion, from loading to firing, was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Its precision suggested that civilization itself could be measured in the careful rotation of a shell before flight. The United States called itself the arsenal of democracy, and few machines embodied that phrase more completely. Each 240mm howitzer represented thousands of workers in factories, miners in the hills of Pennsylvania, and dockhands loading ships by night. When its barrel spoke, it carried the voice of a continent organized for one purpose. It was industry converted into sound. German prisoners who later worked on American farms often recalled the same impression, that America's true strength was not aggression, but abundance. They had seen it in the fields, in the power grids, and in the guns that broke their fortresses. The M1 was a physical translation of that idea. Precision, production, and perseverance fused into metal. Today, only a handful of these guns survive. One stands at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, its barrel aimed toward the horizon. Another rests in Aberdeen Proving Ground, where it once thundered. Their paint has faded, their breeches rusted, yet they still command silence from those who stand before them. Children climb on the wheels and ask how far it could shoot. Veterans answer softly, saying only that it could reach beyond sight. For them, distance was not just geography. It was time, the long reach between war and peace, between destruction and rebuilding. The story of the 240mm howitzer is not simply about a gun. It is about what happens when intellect and industry align with necessity. It shows that technology alone cannot win a war. It must be joined with purpose and restraint. Each round cost thousands of dollars and hours of human effort. Yet the men who fired them rarely spoke of waste. They spoke of duty and the strange beauty of precision under chaos. Modern strategists still quote the figures: weight, range, velocity. But the real measurement lies elsewhere, in what the weapon revealed about the civilization that built it. It proved that democracy, when organized, could wield power equal to any empire without becoming one. In documentaries and archives, the deep voice of the M1 sometimes returns. Sound engineers reconstruct it from recordings made during test firings. Through headphones, it feels less like hearing and more like remembering an earthquake. Students who listen to it often look up in surprise, as if expecting the ground to move. That reaction, a blend of awe and disbelief, is perhaps the truest legacy of the weapon. It reminds us how human ingenuity can both create and terrify, how progress and destruction share the same workshop. The 240mm M1 was never merely a tool of war. It was a mirror held up to the century that forged it. When historians speak of turning points, they often name battles, treaties, or leaders. But sometimes, a turning point is mechanical. The day the M1 first fired, in anger, marked the end of the age when walls defined safety. It marked the beginning of an age where knowledge and coordination mattered more than thickness of stone. To the Germans who faced it, the Black Dragon was a monster from another world. To the Americans who served it, it was simply a job that had to be done. To posterity, it stands as proof that power can be both awe-inspiring and sobering. Every revolution in warfare carries within it a lesson about the limits of human control. The 240mm Howitzer M1 taught one such lesson. It showed that victory achieved through sheer capacity demands equal responsibility in peace. Those who built it went home to build houses, highways, and schools, still using the discipline they learned beside its thunder. When you walk past one of these silent giants today, imagine the thousands of hands that shaped it. Imagine the sound that once rolled across oceans. And remember that even in the darkest moments of history, the same craftsmanship that forges weapons can also rebuild worlds. Long before the roar of the 240mm howitzer echoed through Europe, humanity had always tried to bend the laws of nature to its defense. From the catapults of Carthage to the bombards of medieval Europe, every age produced its own machine to hurl stone, iron, or fire at the walls built by fear. The story of artillery is the story of civilization's desire to protect and to prevail, a story of invention born equally from anxiety and imagination. The first great siege engines were crude but brilliant. Wood, rope, and tension gave way to gunpowder and bronze. When the Ottomans broke Constantinople's walls in 1453, the sound of their cannons was said to have shaken the faith of empires. Each generation since has heard its own version of that thunder. By the 20th century, the craft of artillery had become both science and spectacle. The 240mm howitzer stood at the summit of that journey, the last instrument before the atom took its place. In every era, great guns reflected the culture that forged them. The bronze bombards of Renaissance kings proclaimed dynastic pride. The long naval guns of the 19th century spoke for nations ruled by trade and steam. And the steel giants of the Second World War revealed an age of total industry, where power could be measured in tons of steel per man, per hour. To stand beside the M1 was to see that entire lineage embodied in a single object. It was the catapult perfected, the fortress undone, the echo of every armorer's dream to control distance itself. It connected the past's wooden frames to the future's guided missiles in one continuous chain of ambition. Historians often struggle to define progress in warfare. Does a more accurate gun make the world safer or merely more efficient at destruction? The 240mm offers an uncomfortable answer. Progress is neutral until purpose shapes it. In 1944, that purpose was liberation, the breaking of walls that enslaved continents. Yet the same logic of precision and coordination would later guide rockets, drones, and weapons far beyond the reach of human eyesight. The men who served the Black Dragon did not think of that future. They thought of surviving another night, of sending one more shell downrange to silence a bunker. They did not see themselves as inventors of a new era. But history often chooses its pioneers without asking their permission. When the war ended, silence became its own kind of noise. Villages that had lived for months beneath artillery fire could suddenly hear birds again. Children ran through craters now filled with water and flowers. The same valleys that once echoed with shells began to echo with bells. And the guns, those enormous instruments of force, sat rusting in fields that turned green by the season. Farmers used the metal plates as bridges. Children climbed the barrels as playgrounds. Time turned the Black Dragon into a relic, and rust replaced its thunder. But memory does not rust. The sound lived on in dreams, not as terror, but as a strange reminder of how powerful humanity can become when united toward a single purpose, even a terrible one. Every weapon begins as an idea on paper, a line of geometry, before it becomes a line of fire. In that sense, the 240mm was not built by soldiers, but by thinkers. Mathematicians calculating trajectories, metallurgists testing alloys, draftsmen drawing arcs that would one day shake mountains. Their precision was devotion of a kind, devotion to mastery over matter itself. When war demanded their talents, they gave the world an object that turned calculation into consequence. When peace returned, they built bridges, turbines, and spacecraft. The skill that once hurled shells at the Siegfried Line later sent satellites into orbit. The same mathematics that guided the Black Dragon's arc guided the Apollo rockets on theirs. History rarely separates creation from destruction as neatly as we would wish. Decades later, German veterans who had faced the gun often spoke of it not with hatred, but with awe. In interviews conducted throughout the 1960s, they described the bombardments as moments when the Earth itself seemed to change allegiance. Concrete that had once protected them betrayed them, turning to dust under invisible blows. They said it was the first time they understood that the war was not just lost militarily. It was lost industrially, scientifically, and morally. One former engineer remarked that a single American battery held more technology than some of our entire divisions. He meant it literally. The howitzer was not only a gun, it was a demonstration of what coordination, democracy, and education could achieve when fused into purpose. In that revelation, many saw the seed of Germany's later reconstruction, a recognition that strength built on cooperation endures longer than strength built on fear. In the centuries before, fortresses had defined the landscape of Europe. Each hill held a bastion, each border a wall. The 240mm howitzer ended that era. Its shells wrote a new truth across the continent, that safety could not come from isolation. After the war, nations learned to replace stone with treaties and trenches with unions. Steel, once used for shells, became rails and bridges linking countries that had once exchanged only fire. In that sense, the Black Dragon left behind a paradoxical gift. It destroyed walls so completely that Europe never rebuilt them the same way. The cooperation that followed, from the Marshall Plan to the European Union, grew in the open ground where fortifications once stood. The true measure of a weapon is not its range or its caliber, but the change it leaves behind. The 240mm left silence, a silence filled with lessons. It taught that no nation is too strong to fall when blinded by ideology. It proved that technological mastery means little without moral restraint. And it reminded generations afterward that victory achieved through destruction must be followed by creation, or it remains incomplete. When soldiers who had served the gun grew old, many described the moment of firing as strangely peaceful. There was rhythm, coordination, and purpose. It was the quiet before the echo, a heartbeat between effort and outcome. They carried that sense of timing into civilian life, where patience and cooperation built homes instead of craters. From ancient trebuchets to modern missiles, every age finds its own way to throw its fears into the distance. But with each leap in range, humanity also gains a new responsibility. The men who built the Black Dragon understood at last that they were part of a continuum, not an exception. They had inherited centuries of curiosity about how to make the world move, and they would pass that curiosity on to their children, hopefully without the need for another war to justify it. In the classrooms of post-war America and Europe, physics teachers drew parabolas on blackboards to explain motion. Few mentioned that those same curves once decided who lived and who died. The mathematics remained pure, even when its history was not. Perhaps that is humanity's quiet redemption, that the knowledge gained in conflict can return as knowledge for peace. Today, satellites orbit the planet guided by principles once tested in the recoil of heavy guns. Spacecraft fire small thrusters that obey the same laws that sent the 240mm shells arcing over Europe. The difference lies in intent. Where once men aimed at fortresses, they now aim at the stars. The energy is the same. The direction changed. In that transformation lies the real triumph. Every rocket launch, every engineered marvel of peace carries a fragment of those old lessons. That discipline and precision, once forged for war, can illuminate instead of destroy. Imagine a quiet field in spring. Grass grows over faint scars in the earth where the gun pits once stood. Birds nest in the rusted frames of the transport bogies. Rainwater pools where shells once waited to be loaded. If you stand there at dusk, when the wind is still, you might almost hear a low echo beneath the horizon. Not sound, but memory. It is the memory of power contained, of noise turned into silence, of men who learned the limits of their own creation. The 240mm howitzer no longer speaks, yet its message endures in the quiet ithaspan, M1 left behind. Imagine a quiet field in spring. Grass grows over faint scars in the earth where the gun pits once stood. Birds nest in the rusted frames of the transport bogies. Rainwater pools where shells once waited to be loaded. If you stand there at dusk, When the wind is still, you might almost hear a low echo beneath the horizon. Not sound, but memory. It is the memory of power contained, of noise turned into silence, of men who learned the limits of their own creation. The 240mm howitzer no longer speaks, yet its message endures in the quiet Ithasbine, M1 left behind.